Maybe not at the beginning.
Say it again.
Greg Aaron is probably is going to join
Yes,
too.
he's gonna join at the end. At
Yeah.
the end, so I think there's only some few minutes for him to speak at the end. Mm,
I'll be off camera for a while so that I can just rest my eyes, and then when it's my turn, I'll come on.
Okay. We usually give a little bit of 5 to 10 minutes once the time is there, just so that people can transition from my other meetings, and then we'll start.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Kenna, can you hear me? Ikenna, Ikenna, can you hear me?
Yes, Papa, I can hear you.
Okay, a few things. So I will need you to be able to make sure that this is transitioning well. So
Okay.
if you when I introduce Dr. Bashir, then I want you to stable his picture with on the on the slide sharing mode. So if you want to try that now, and I want to see, so we don't have a problem with the transition of the file. So do you want to try? The same videos that you were showing yesterday of the pictures of our speakers and things. Can you please pick up your phone? Welcome everyone. We are going to give a few more minutes. We understand people transition from meetings to this, and once we start, we don't want to go back in time. So we'll give a few more minutes for people to transition. While you're here, I'm just gonna go a little bit about what today will look like. Today is our day 4, and we are going to focus on the on mental health and the mind and the body. And I'll introduce our moderator for today, which will be Dr. Bashir Zubai, and he will moderate the session today. There will be a few polls that we will want you to answer. So those polls, when the time is come, we will put it in the chat box. So if you Dr. Bashir, I don't know if you want them to put that now or after I introduce you, then you put that, or if they can put it now so that people can begin to respond to those polls while I do the initial introduction. So you can, do you want to put the poll?
Well, the plan is to actually put it there when just before the introduction of the speakers.
Okay. Okay. All right. Good. Minutes, and we will get started.
bensound.com. 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 bensound.com.
right, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on the part of the world where you are. And welcome to the fourth day of our program at the Nigerian Implementation Science Alliance, brought to you in collaboration with the Ivan Research Institute Nigeria. The What we have had over the years has been an opportunity to bring experts in implementation science, experts in implementation practice, and those who work as researchers in institutions, and those who work in the policy space, and those who work in the implementing programs. The idea is that we can share things we have learned with each other. We're able to focus on areas of importance to the Nigeria as a country and the Africa as a region. So over the days, these last few days, we reserve 2 hours every day to come together and then be able to have a discussion on different things. On the first day, we looked at implementation science overview and the future, the current place where we are and the future. On the second day, we talked about capacity building in implementation science. And the third day, we did look at implementation science in chronic disease. And today we are focusing on mental health, looking at the mind and the body. And tomorrow we are going to round up the week with the implementation science in cancer prevention and control. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Bashir Zubad, who is a renowned global health leader with a 26-year experience. He is a pediatrician by training, and he works in health system strengthening and HIV program implementation. He currently serves as Chief of Party for the Georgetown Global Health Nigeria, the USAID-funded ACE2 project. He holds a bachelor's in medicine, a master's in public health, and a master's in business administration, and is a fellow of the West African College of Physicians. Dr. Zubair has led several high-funded projects across Nigeria and is widely recognized for his work in HIV, especially in drug-resistant TB and infection control. He is a member of the International AIDS Society, the Pediatric Association of Nigeria, and I will say he's one of the founding members for the Nigerian Implementation Science Alliance. So thank you, and join me today to welcome Dr. Bashir, who will moderate our 2-hour session. Dr. Bashir, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Good morning, everyone from all over the world. I want to welcome you sincerely to join this session. The topic for today, mind-body divide, rethinking mental health implementation in global health settings, invite us to challenge the long-standing silos and push for integration, not just clinically, but structurally. So today we have an engaging session plan, but first I think we should just loosen up. You should not answer the poll on the chat box. Please enter there and quickly answer the poll while I will introduce the speakers for today's sessions. Right. The first speaker that I want to introduce to you today is Dr. John Bosco. Dr. John Bosco is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Nigeria and a Fulbright scholar dedicated to advancing mental health equity. He's a research fellow who is a researcher who explores how individual and social cultural factors shape mental well-being across the life course. He has a particular focus on innovative strategies to deliver quality mental health care to undeserved and marginalized population. He is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the College of Human Medicine, Michigan State University, and a senior research fellow at Ivan Research Institute in Nigeria. He is also the editor of the Nigerian Journal of Psychology Research, a peer-reviewed journal established in 1986 that supports the mission of psychological research in Nigeria and beyond. Please join me in welcome Dr. John Bosco Chukwuoji.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bashir. Can I share my screen?
Yes, please go ahead. Over to you.
Let me know if you are able to see it.
Is visible? I'm on
Thank you.
slide.
Yes, we can see. Thank you.
Right. I am happy to be here today, and the title of my presentation is not just what works, but what works here. A roadmap for emerging African mental health scholars. If we already know what works for post-traumatic stress disorder, why are so many people who have experienced trauma still suffering without help? As you think through that question, I have come to realize that it is not just about what works, but for whom, why, how, and when. And so this is the central question that implementation science tries to answer by getting the help that people need where they need them. And these places could be in the schools, in the prisons, in the hospital settings, or in their work settings, or even in the community where they live. I have some declarations to make. First is that I work for the National Center for Health and Justice Integration for Suicide Prevention. That is the NCHATS project. It is a P50 project sponsored by the National Institutes for Health. And the goal of the project is to identify individuals who are involved with the justice system that are at risk for suicide and connect them to care while measuring effectiveness and cost effectiveness outcomes. Second, my background is psychology, and most of my illustrations or experiences or examples in my presentation are going to come from that background. I am not an expert in implementation science yet. I am an enthusiast, and that is the best way that I could just describe myself. I'm deeply interested in it and committed to learning more. That shouldn't also mean that you are not free to ask technical questions about implementation science. We have video and we have research here. So any of the questions I'm unable to attempt to answer, they are here to help. I also acknowledge that the Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. The university resides on land ceded in the 1819 of Saginaw. Where do I come from? I come from Nema Town, and it's a rural community in an area local government area of Enugu State. I spent the first wave of my life here for my elementary education before I proceeded to the Sacred Heart Seminary at Nsude, still in Enugu State, for my junior secondary education, and to St. John Cross Seminary in Nsukka for my high school. After my 6 years of secondary education, I became a pupil teacher or prefect teacher at Sacred Heart Seminary in Nsude. The picture by the right is a picture with some of my colleagues when we were teaching. That is about the most fulfilling year of my life because I discovered my calling, which is to teach. And instead of proceeding to become a priest, I decided to rather seek higher education and go to become a lecturer. I wasn't sure of what I wanted to do in terms of the discipline to study, but while I was still trying to gain admission, I worked with my mom in our farms in my town. And during those years, she told me stories of the Nigerian Biafran War and the horrifying experiences associated with it, which led me to begin to think of how to solve human mental health problems. And in a discussion with one of my classmates in the seminary, he mentioned clinical psychology. I checked it out more and then applied to study psychology. I enrolled to study psychology at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and after my bachelor's degree program, I came for my master's. During my master's program, one of my internship experiences was at the Department of Psychological Medicine, University of Nigeria Teaching Hospital, Enugu. And that was when I came in contact with Professor Eche. It was during one of those times that they were doing the baby shower project, and he used to visit Nigeria. And so I met him one of those times and the other collaborators. And that was the first time I heard about something called implementation science. So from my contact with him, we wrote a paper which I presented at the 2014 National Conference of the Nigerian Psychological Association. And that paper was bridging the gap between psychological science and practice through implementation science. After my master's program, I applied for the Fulbright Fellowship, and the Fulbright program was at Cleveland State University in Ohio. But before I left for the Fulbright program, my master's program was also a very pivotal experience because I studied post-traumatic stress disorder among internally displaced TIF persons in Nigeria. While I was making my presentation, one of the questions that I was asked for during that presentation for my master's was, you found this high prevalence of PTSD. What did you do? That was a very striking question for me. I did something because I did a group psychotherapy for those respondents or participants in my study. But I knew that was not enough. And that question has continued to stay with me. What was interesting was that during the person that led me into the IDP camps is a priest of the Catholic Church. And so what would have worked for that community is if there was a way for that priest who has regular contact with them to be prepared to at least do something to help these people. But I would have started delving into something related to helping those people in the community immediately, but I also needed to make progress in my teaching career, which was to enroll in a PhD. The PhD was not in implementation science. I continued to do my PhD in clinical psychology, but I still kept my eye to looking out for opportunities, which was what the Fulbright program offered. I was interested in not just doing the ordinary things that my colleagues were doing in Nigeria. I needed to know more and to do more. And so, unlike the traditional lines of research, I felt if I was to do clinical psychology, probably trying to understand more of PTSD in a laboratory setting would be the best approach, which was what I did at Cleveland State University, trying to understand whether emotion regulation serves as protective mechanisms through which depression arises in people who have experienced childhood sexual abuse. I returned to Nigeria in 2020, got my PhD in 2021. After my PhD, we tried to, with the Ivan Research Institute and CTA, to get some grants with which I would have continued my training in implementation science, but we were not successful, including grants that we applied for in Nigeria through the TED Fund. And so I had to move on to search opportunities in the US, which is why I am currently at the Michigan State University College of Human Medicine, learning implementation science. Why am I doing implementation research? First is that it is a pathway to a purposeful career for me. I have started becoming increasingly dissatisfied with what I was doing, and which is that I go to class and I teach students, and when they want to do their research, they still continue doing that same research the same way I was doing it. The way I was doing it is that a lot of the research in psychology we do in Nigeria is mostly just doing observational study where, for example, you go to distribute questionnaires and get responses from people and then analyze your data. So we end up discovering problems, more and more of problems, without finding solutions to those problems. That is not what I would want to continue doing. That is not how I would want to continue training my students. Second is that I want to bridge the gap between what we know works and what is working in reality. There are a lot of things that work, but many people don't receive it. I gave the instance of my experience at the internally displaced persons camp in Benue State, Nigeria. There are a lot of things we know that could have worked, but these people that need those help are not receiving it. Implementation science and implementation research also opens the door to global collaboration and funding for me. Currently, we are talking about several ideas for research, for funding applications. It is also interdisciplinary and collaborative. The interdisciplinary nature becomes meaningful to me as someone coming from an environment where psychology is still not properly accorded its place and recognized in Nigeria, even within medical settings. They are marginalized. They are not properly allowed to do the right things they should do and they could have done. And so in implementation science, I'm able to come to the same table to discuss with people from all fields of life on an equal status. It is an emerging field with high demand. And so because it is something that it's still coming up, it's still growing, the best is to join in it and grow with it. Implementation research is also used to inform mental health policy. And it becomes also very useful to us in Nigeria because our mental health policies are still being developed. They are still in the formative stages. And so if we generate enough evidence and are able to see how this evidence work and how they help people, we will be able to support policy formulations. It's also, implementation science is also contextual, community engaged, and very important in sustainable scaling in local systems, which is also something very spectacular when you think about the African setting or the African environment where some of us come from. A lot of, for example, a lot of people in Nigeria, when you talk about psychology, though, are you those people that study the mind? So you know what I am thinking about. So if we are saying that people do not know much about our discipline or our profession, what we should do is to see how we can get people involved in what we are doing. And implementation science offers us that veritable platform to get people into what we are doing, working with community leaders, religious leaders, working with policymakers, working with people who live the experience of mental health. When they know more about what we do, they are going to appreciate us better. So, but there are a lot of challenges or cracks in the bridge of mental health implementation science in Africa. First is that the burden of mental health is huge. About 70% of people who need mental health services in Africa do not receive it. So this is a very big issue. I know my colleagues that are in the clinical setting in psychiatric hospitals that have left clinical practice to join teaching in universities because of the huge burden of work they are expected to do. We also have resource constraints in terms of infrastructure and funding and limited expertise in the mental health professions. But if we also recognize the very important role of the institutions like the Ivan Research Institute and the various innovations they are doing, for example, the Nisa, the Nigerian Implementation Science Alliance Model Innovation Research Centers, that offers a veritable infrastructure for people to do all forms of research in the healthcare settings. Cultural diversity, for some people, could be regarded as a challenge, but for me, I would rather look at it as a resource. It becomes a limitation when we ignore that cultural diversity. And the beauty of the Nisa mix, for example, is that it recognizes the cultural diversity in Nigeria by having these model innovation research centers across the geopolitical zones of Nigeria. And so if we have any finding of what works, we can be sure that it will work for almost all the parts of Nigeria. Stigma is a major issue. But to solve the problem of stigma, we need to work with what is currently working, existing frameworks, existing institutions. To fight stigma, for example, as a mental health expert, if I get religious leaders that communities trust into what I'm doing, the job is almost done. There are also policy and systemic level barriers. And how we intend to navigate this in the African setting is to integrate these mental health services into the systems that are already effective and functioning. For example, maternal mental health, HIV programs, or the school systems. I am not sure currently of any implementation work that is ongoing that is anchored on the school system in Nigeria. But that is something that one can build on. Data and measurement are also serious issues. A lot of the measures in implementation science are developed in the Western parts of the world. And one thing that we should have been able to do for ourselves is to have existing data of mental health issues in our local setting. I remember when we were trying to submit a grant recently, we tried to find out whether there are documented evidence of suicide attempts or suicidal behavior in the hospital settings in Nigeria. And it was a very big headache to find that. There are also limited training opportunities. Limited because the need is so huge that institutions like Ivan are constrained in meeting the demand of people that need to be trained in doing implementation science. I am not sure, apart from the University of Ghana and 2 other universities in South Africa, that of any other university where implementation science is offered as a course at the master's level, where you can do master's in implementation science in Africa, apart from the University of Ghana and those 2 universities. No university in Nigeria currently gives you a degree, a master's degree in implementation science. People who do public health at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka are able to do implementation research, but the program is master's in public health. I have been in implementation science, learning it and growing in it, and it has been very beneficial for me. One of the gains from it is that when I talk to my peers and colleagues in the psychology space, they listen because I tell them what they do not know. I tell them what they should be doing or how we could have done things in a better way. Some of the terms I mentioned are probably things some of them are hearing for the first time, but perhaps it challenged them to know more. Recently, just last year in 2024, the Department of Psychology at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka also got a sub-award for telemental health service. And that was funded by the Healthy Sunrise Foundation and the Alvan Research Institute. The goal of that sub-award is to provide the infrastructure, including solar power, including the communication gadgets, for us to provide telemental health service to people living with HIV, primarily in all parts of the world. But the services have also become beneficial, not just to people living with HIV, but to anyone that needs mental health services. I am the MPI for that award with Professor Iko Nyishi. I've also been able to benefit from cross-disciplinary collaborations through implementation science and implementation research. And it has exposed me to mentorship and networks that works. Because, for example, in the current project we are doing, you see a lot of people from various fields outside psychology that I am working with. And we have that mutual exchange of ideas and knowledge. So how can an emerging scholar in Africa navigate the implementation terrain? First is to dig your well before you get thirsty. Digging your well before you get thirsty means, for example, that a lot of us in Africa are usually wait for us to become lecturers or for us to have our PhD before we start publications or doing publications. That is not how it works. As long as you are in the university, even as an undergraduate student, start attending conferences, start connecting with people. Conferences cost money. But I remember that after my bachelor's degree, my supervisor said, oh, this your project is good enough to be presented at a conference. And he funded my travel from Nsukka to Nasarawa State University for the 2010 National Conference of the Nigerian Psychological Association. And I presented the paper there. And we've continued to grow. I didn't wait. I started my master's, didn't get a job at UNN until 2014 when I was almost done with my PhD, with my master's, when I was interested in becoming at least a graduate assistant to keep going from there. But I wasn't wasting my time. I used those times to be writing publications, writing journal articles, and publishing. I tell people I was doing it when I didn't know the value of what I was doing. I was just doing it for the fun of it. But it continues to pay off for me. Learning implementation science in a system that is resistant to change is a big problem. If, for example, I proposed to do an implementation-related research for my master's, there would have been some resistance. A lot of people are not interested in for you to bring in new things that they do not know about. So it appears as if you are coming to teach them. That's a mentality we need to keep in mind. But it's not a problem. I did the usual thing they wanted me to do to get my degree, but I still kept my eye on what I know is going to be more fruitful, both for me and for the society. Where do you get the training? Alvan Research Institute is here to fill a gap. Like there was a gap in my contact with Professor Eche and in my working with him because unlike between 2014 to 2020, when Ivan started having virtual programs, he just visits Nigeria for for his research visits, and that's the much contact we usually have with him. But currently, people that are associated with Ivan have that opportunity of meeting with him at least once a week during the weekly meetings. And when you reach out to him and you want to set up a Zoom meeting, that is possible compared to before now when it was just only email communications that we were doing. There are people in Ivan Research Institute that are not lecturers in a university. They are just working for the Ivan Research Institute. So he must not be a lecturer to be in our Ivan Research Institute. Funding also goes to what solves the most pressing problems of the society. The most pressing problems of the society, whether it is a problem in schools, whether it is a problem in communities, whether it is a problem in government agencies or in the hospital settings, are solvable through implementation science. And funding agencies are pushing money into it. You are going to hear from Vidya more on this. When there is no structured incentive, motivate yourself. Do not wait for you to start receiving salaries before you begin to do research. The publications are worth doing, even when there are no financial incentives associated with it. The gains will come. Then relevance is not about your starting point. I know we come from an environment where, for example, if I did my bachelor's in psychology, did my master's in public health, and maybe did my PhD in organizational behavior, somebody is going to have a difficulty employing me to teach in the department of psychology. But who cares in this modern world? Why you shouldn't care is that there is more to the world. There is more to see. There is more to be done than what is just happening in Nigeria. And then most importantly too, is that some private universities do not think like some of the traditional public universities. Some private universities are still going to employ you, even if you didn't have that linear relationship of your degrees. So if you have not done your PhD and you have a master's, you can explore opportunities to do PhD in implementation science or do a work related to implementation science, even if it is outside your field. At the long run, you will be better off than those people who just continued in their traditional fields. My supervisor, Dr. Jennifer Johnson at the Michigan State University Department of Public Health had her first degree in physics. She came into psychology, did master's in clinical psychology and PhD in clinical psychology. Today, how I found her was that I just typed in Google, implementation science researchers in the US. That was what I typed in Google. And a number of names popped up, including her own. And then I reached out, got connected, opportunities came, I applied and got the job. If you check the top funded researchers in OBYGN in the US, her name is there. But she has a PhD in clinical psychology. Then you also see Gregory Aarons. Greg Aarons is a professor of organizational and clinical psychology and has developed a lot of measures and frameworks in implementation science, but his background is psychology. You should also try to read journal articles on implementation science. So sometimes when I ask people, like the question I always ask people, especially those that I am training is, oh, how many journal articles have you read on an issue when we are talking? So you do not necessarily need to have formal trainings in it if the opportunity is not there. Read journals on that, and there is a journal called Implementation Science. Just type it in Google and it will pop up. Read articles that are published in it. At least if you read at least one article on implementation science every week before the year ends, by next year you will be speaking the language of implementation science and implementation research.
So
You should also
I know that we were trying to get to also space out the time so that we have time for questions.
yes, this is my
We
concluding thoughts.
okay. Good.
Yes. So in conclusion, if we don't implement what works in our communities, who will? Let's build the bridge between science and service. It is the pathway to change lives through a science that is active, applied, and African-led. Now is the perfect time. There are policy developments that are ongoing in Nigeria in mental health. For example, the future of mental health in Africa depends on how well we implement, not just innovate, how well we deliver, not just discover. Here are some of my contact information. I'm on almost all social media platforms. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that thoughtful and passionate presentation. Let's open the floor for questions. I think we'll go to the Q&A platforms and we can discuss those questions.
So one of the things that we may do, Bashir, so that we can take time is that can we hold on questions so people can put that in the chat box, because I want us to get to the interactive sessions where we actually do that so that we can move on to the Dr. Vedam to be able to add a presentation, and then they will now both of them have the question session so that because it is important to hear from someone who is at early career stage. I think that is the most important time to hear this message. If you're hearing this message that he's talking about now as a professor, it's probably too late for you in certain pathway. You may no longer have the flexibility, but if you're hearing this at your early stage, you actually can resonate what he's talking about and the opportunities and the self-motivation that is there. So what we're going to do is that if you can put your questions in the Q&A, and then Bashir, if you move on to introduce Dr. Vidya, and then we'll come back to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. It's now my distinct pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Vidya Vedam. Dr. Vedam is a trained molecular biologist and a senior scientist at the Center for Global Mental Health Research, where she oversees research on suicide prevention, mental health integration, and implementation science. She leads initiatives to integrate mental health into chronic disease care and translates evidence into practice to improve outcomes globally. She has a prior leadership position at the NCI Center for Global Health. Dr. Vedam brings a cross-disciplinary expertise and a system-level approach to advancing sustainable public health solutions. So her work sits at the intersection of biomedical research, strategy program design, and international health equity. Dr. Vidya, the floor is virtually yours now.
Thanks, Dr. Zubair, for the lovely introduction. Is it possible for me
Yes,
to
you
share?
can. Yes, you can, please. Yes.
Great. Thank you. Let me know if you can see the slides in the correct mode.
Not yet. We can see you, but not the slides.
Oh, really? Okay. It says it's showing on my end here. Let me for one more second.
Okay, it's coming up. Yes, we can see it. It's not in slide mode yet, but we can see it.
Okay. Better?
Yes, now it's in slide mode. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Vidya Vedam as a senior scientist at the Center for Global Mental Health Research at NIMH. It's a pleasure being here, and thanks for the opportunity. Before I get started, I wanted to quickly have a disclaimer that this talk and the points I make are my own observations and opinions based on the field from my vantage point of view and do not reflect that of our agency. So for decades, why do we have to rethink global mental health implementation research? For decades, global health has perpetuated this mind-body divide, where mental health has been siloed away from physical health. And when I say physical health, I mean all of the other health conditions, be it cancer or cardiovascular conditions or any other ailments, many of which, including HIV, many of which are associated with chronicity. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. However, bearing in mind that the global burden of mental illness is growing, implementation efforts for mental health now must consider this new reality of whole health. How do you address that? To address complex mental health challenges that are emerging, we have to move away from solely focusing on developing interventions for each condition individually and rethinking implementation of health interventions itself. And so today, my talk will explore how do we discuss whole health, chronicity, and integration of health for improving health outcomes. How can implementation research evolve to generate evidence to support sustainable programs that are grounded in contextual realities, and a case for reciprocal knowledge exchange and a shared future for global mental health implementation research. I just want us to pause and think about how this mental physical health divide or dualism started. So and think take us through past this divide of the Cartesian divide around separating the body and mind. Modern medicine traditionally has followed this Cartesian dualism, separating mind and body. However, many indigenous cultures, especially from the global south, have never adopted this because traditionally there was no mind and body separation. In many of the older communities, illness is often framed in relational and communal terms. So illness is considered a disturbance of not just the individual body, but of social and emotional ecosystem. So really thinking about health, not just from a condition, but a more holistic view of the individual experiencing the illness and their connection with their community. So it's really thinking about a collectivist approach to health. Emerging systems biology, neuroscience, and indigenous practices have recognized this interdependence. When we understand mental health as a long-term and non-linear approach, then our implementation strategies for mental health care must therefore change accordingly. They must be designed for durability, adaptability, and integration of this multiism of health conditions. Therefore, implementation research must measure and adapt to the social process of healthcare. Here's a few examples of how mental and physical health conditions are actually interconnected. There's a growing body of literature showing the interconnectedness of chronicity and its implication and its continuous loop of implications of how one affects the other. So for example, depression is associated with chronic stress, systemic inflammation, dysregulation of your HPA axis, and increased sympathetic nervous system activity, all of which contribute to cardiovascular disease. So it's not depression need not be just treating depression need not be just a mental health condition alone, but this definitely has implications on physical health. Similarly, individuals with mental illness, especially serious mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, are at an increased risk for metabolic syndrome, including diabetes and cardiovascular diseases, due to a combination of factors, not just from the mental health condition, but including the psychiatric medications they are on, their lifestyle factors that like smoking or alcohol consumption or substance abuse that are associated with the mental health condition, and then the more social issues and structural issues such as access to medical care or socioeconomic conditions. So it's really an integrated process as you can think about it. Chronic inflammation, cortisol dysfunction, and other unhealthy habits related to depression also contribute to insulin resistance and glucose tolerance. And these, therefore, individuals with depression often often have type 2 diabetes. So this mutual relationship of chronicity and chronic health conditions can actually exacerbate mental health, and these conditions can feed off of each other and make the individual's health, overall health, suffer. So there's this bidirectional pathways that necessitate integrated and not siloed service models. So integration of care, healthcare, is not an option anymore. It becomes essential. There's growing interest and implementation research globally, as John Bosco has pointed out. Many countries are realizing the importance of growing this body of evidence in a very systematic and organized way, but the gap still exists in how this knowledge is generated. For example, many implementation frameworks are still being developed in high-income, resource-rich settings, whereas a lot of the innovations in terms of implementation practice are demonstrated from the global south or low resource settings, particularly from the global south. Now, these innovations are often underrepresented in shaping the global implementation research ethos. So we need to figure out mechanisms for mutual learning and shared knowledge generation. So what are these innovations from Global South? So, as I mentioned, Global South has, for many settings in the Global South, one of the key issues is the limitation in resources or wealth that is associated with providing care. So that really shapes the way healthcare has been provided despite all of these restrictions that are imposed on the communities and the settings. So, for example, local knowledge and community contexts are often utilized in mental health implementation. Innovation in participatory models such as needs assessment, community engagement, and tailored delivery mechanisms that are really nuanced to address the needs of the community are often seen. There's an iterative competency building, if you will, in these models where it's not very academic institution driven and not static modules of academic training, but more that is focused on real world variation and adaptation to complexity. So some of these examples include that have led to actual meaningful interventions for mental health in global settings are the friendship bench model from Zimbabwe, which shows that lay counselors can deliver evidence-based mental health care. And this has shown some stellar results to reduce depression and anxiety in the communities by about 50%. Similarly, ASHA workers who are, trained community health workers who really substitute for a lot of healthcare in rural settings, mainly to bridge the rural service gaps, have begun for the last almost 2 decades, integrating behavioral health and maternal health into community care. And part of that also includes mental health care as a first line of care for these rural communities where there is almost no access to mental health services. Similarly, the National Depression Program in Chile really focuses on mental health integration in the primary care improving detection and early treatment for the populations. So with that said, what are some of the emerging spaces for shared innovation and research? And where right now is the field growing in terms of collaboration and innovation? So as I noted, there's a lot of interest and research being focused on developing community-based health models. These studies reveal a pattern that community-based, culturally rooted, and resource-adapted interventions thrive when traditional or a more global north, top-down traditional health systems tend to fail in these remote settings. Similarly, there's a lot of interest in digital infrastructure and digital and hybrid models of care. Particularly after the COVID pandemic, the whole world rethought of how digital healthcare can provide or substitute or circumvent some of the restrictions that are associated with in-person care. So digital infrastructure that is extensively developed in the global north and supports wide reach now has been, there's interest from the global south in thinking about how to take this the strides that are made in the global north and think of human-centered, low-tech engagement methods that will service for not just mental health care, but service for other healthcare systems as well. And one good example is there's a tremendous increase as an NIH program officer. We've seen several projects that come through which use simple technologies and that have been successfully used for many areas of access, such as WhatsApp or SMS models that require low bandwidth or minimal bandwidth, but have high engagement potential. And so the research frontier now has a new tool to think about scalable, culturally attuned, and accessible care that really bridges the connectivity divides within these communities. And there's also models for shaping global implementation research, not really in terms of developing new interventions, but really thinking of how to integrate interventions so that you get a better return of investment, not just for the research, but for the public health dollars as well, investment as well. So I wanted to take a pause here and talk a little about this, one of the key elements of my presentation. I really want to highlight where there is a need for complementarity and where there's a need for us to work together. So thinking about the global north, there, as I noted in my earlier part of the presentation, there's been a tremendous amount of work that is done in developing structured trial designs, validity tools, theories, models, and frameworks that really have built the field of implementation science as it currently stands. But that said, regardless of the strides that has been made, and in almost parallelly, yet independently somehow in the global south, there has been tremendous innovation in models that really the global north is now coming to terms with this, such as task shifting, cultural congruence, and low-cost scalability and adaptation that really could benefit the field of implementation science. So there's these two groups that really bring practice and theories together in a really amazing way. So what really we're thinking about is complementing these skills to produce robust, transferable implementation science frameworks that really, not to improve the knowledge base, but make implementation a practical approach for both all kinds of settings, whether you're in the global north or in the global south. So why do we have to rethink implementation through this lens of complementarity? Popular implementation science frameworks have been developed largely in high-income settings where you had an ability to provide, the control systems and academic environment for developing and models around and emphasizing fidelity, replication, and scale up. We must now, but that said, we understand that these models have a limitation when we try to adapt them in real world settings, whether it is in the global north. It's especially true in some of the communities, rural communities, or the access limited communities within countries like US and Canada. And then, so there's a shift that's required from scaling fidelity to supporting flexibility. This means creating frameworks or adjusting our frameworks that accommodate diverse delivery structures and not just validating single intervention models anymore. So that's where I'd like for the field to think about in the next phase. Strengthening of implementation science models, therefore, lies in its ability to support mutual learning across these two systems and geographies. Opportunities. So with that said, what are or where are some of the opportunities for global mental health implementation fields in terms of next steps? So there's definitely an interest in expanding framework flexibility. As I noted, we have an amazing range of models and theories, models, and framework that really can be adapted to various settings, but the data to adapt that, make that adaptations and provide real world evidence base for thinking about what that would entail is really an area that's worth exploring and still a huge gap, if you will. There's a need for fostering more bidirectional thought and knowledge, a flow of knowledge for improving innovation, particularly in terms of developing resilient, transferable solutions that work in different settings. So trying to understand what are the key elements that implementation science has always been focused on to really think more carefully about the context in which they can be applicable. What are the contextual models? Again, thinking of relational, cultural, and informal settings in which these adaptations will be meaningfully sustained. And then broadening evidence standards. So one of the key areas or one of the points of tension is understanding what really data and evidence is. So recognizing the value of real world practice-based evidence and traditional methods attuned to implementation realities from Global South would really help develop this field further. So while it's fun to say we can all work together and create a better implementation research field, what are some of the realities that shape or provide limitations for global implementation research to grow and practice to sustain? So thinking about implementation gaps when formal structures do not really align with community realities. So there's always this pull and push between what the systems can offer and what the community in terms of their demands and their needs. So there's a demand versus supply, gap that needs to be bridged in real world settings. So if you think about in this in diagram, what I've tried to think of articulate is thinking of an individual's request from being well, state of being well, which is where we all want us to be and the communities to be, to being ill, where there is a lot of demand for services and both from the individuals and from the system itself, and where the system typically tends to offer. So I want us to pause and think, is there room for us to be on the left side of this, where there's more a planning or a preparation in terms of where the field, especially implementation research, can provide services to think about and to forecast and model what are some of the demands that would be from the wellness point of view that can be embedded into the frameworks of care that we are providing, so as we are more shifting the communities more towards wellness as opposed to illness. So if you think about these implementation tensions, so community realities, which means what are the demands from the community, and system capacities, what are the supply issues. So community realities really focus on understanding needs, access, and trust from the community. So mental health, for example, is deeply tied to beliefs, stigma, family structure, and community norms. Programs that ignore this are often underutilized, even when there is tremendous evidence to support that these interventions work. So really thinking about how do we make this more palatable to the audience that we want to provide care is really key. Cultural frameworks, trust networks, and informal systems, therefore, must be integral to any implementation effort. Now, from the system's capacity, of course, every system has its limitations. So what are this, it typically systems work in service design, coverage, and resource allocations. So most systems are optimized primarily, be it in the global north or in the global south, or high income settings, low income settings, or in rural versus urban. Across these different systems, most systems are often optimized for acute individual-based care. How do we rethink this community-based chronic mental health care? Therefore, will strain the system and push the system, because the system is currently not in within their limitations, due to provide these cares. So how do we therefore think of implementation research that really focuses on shifting this paradigm to more task shifting like approaches, to think of providing care without compromising quality, and more importantly, cultural and contextual relevance of the interventions or care. So what's the key takeaway from this? Effective mental health implementation bridges systems and communities, and needs to think about moving from wellness, moving the population more towards wellness and recovery. So I want us to next think about, if we have this system where we are working towards moving individuals to wellness and recovery, what are some of the other pieces that we need to consider? In traditional research, for example, the gold standard for any work is often the outcome. Did something work? But the beauty of implementation science, it flips the question and asks, the gold standard here is not did it work, but how did it work and why did it work? How did it evolve, adapt, survive real world, and did it survive the real world complexity? So in implementation, the process is often more constructive or instructive than the outcome itself. Therefore, we need to further develop tools and that are better at studying the journey and not just focus on the destination. If we overemphasize on endpoints, that may blind us to understanding and making these valuable mid-course corrections or iterations that really are context-driven or are focused on insights from working within the context. So again, I want to emphasize that implementation needs to be inherently iterative and emergent, and it must therefore be, the onus is on the field to move the field to that place of being iterative and emergent. And again, to belabor the point on iteration is the heartbeat of implementation. Implementation is dynamic, conditions change, stakeholders shift, and resources, most importantly, fluctuate. But we still need to implement things. So some of the three success features really are the 3 Fs: fit, friction, and flexibility. Rigid replication, if we focus on that, we miss out on local adaptations that really will help us think about real world sustainment or sustainability. Systems, therefore, must think about how complex problems demand dynamic learning and change. And successful model is not the one that is rigid and works all the time in certain conditions, but one that is flexible and works all the time in every possible condition. So our lesson from our global south, which has done a lot of implementation without really developing the science of implementation, if you will, is to think about implementation in cycles, and that the process is more responsive and therefore thinking about long-term sustainment. So I also want to think about outcomes. Outcomes without context are completely unusable. And this is a reality that every implementation scientist has to grapple with. So success in one setting, as you can imagine, does not imply that success will work is true for any other setting. So it's always context adaptation through meaningful engagement is the key to success. Many clinical trials, particularly randomized clinical trials, often view as deviations as errors. However, in implementation science, deviations are seen as intelligence and a place for learning. So adaptation, therefore, equals engagement, and engagement predicts sustainable impact. So adaptation details how the intervention is being modeled, tested, and reshaped, which is which actually indicates it's like a temperature check to say that the intervention is alive and working within the system. This aligns with the idea of the learning health system model that uses data and experience to evolve continuously. And again, I think I sound like a broken record, but Global South has done the philosophy adaptation. It almost is a necessity for decades now. Moving further beyond iteration and focusing not on the outcomes but on the process itself, I also want to really think about implementation not as a field exclusively driven and focused on implementation scientists or trained implementation scientists themselves. Implementation science actually interacts with clinical, operational, socio-cultural, and behavioral domains within each context. So you really need a variety of expertise that spans these disciplines that therefore better equip us to adapt interventions meaningfully. So context, in this case, it's not noise, it's the medium in which the implementation takes roots. So implementation research is a multidisciplinary field. And if I think about mental health implementation, for example, I think of implementation in this field as a shared responsibility. Mental health workforce is not just limited to psychiatrists or psychologists. Community workers, for example, teachers, traditional healers, even family members all play key roles. And this has been demonstrated through several examples, particularly from our Global South partners, where they have shown time and again that these models are effective, cost effective, and most importantly, sustainable and are impactful within their settings. So a shared model, therefore, democratizes mental health delivery, and this is true for other healthcare as well, and expands the reach of our interventions. So I just wanted, this is a quick table on just highlighting all of the points I've made. So I don't want to, go through them again in the interest of time, but to really think of that both systems may have limitations. Developing really structured frameworks, focusing on metrics, fidelity tracking are all some of the gold standards that have been developed in the high resource settings. And then South, Global South, for example, and many of our low and middle income country partners have often focused on contextualization, adaptability, and therefore there is the system really needs to bring together a form of research that focuses on resilient architecture for global mental health care. So the take-home message is global implementation science is a team sport and we have to work together. Lastly, a few takeaways from my talk today. Going back to my original beginning of the slide, mind and body separation is a medical, structural, and epistemological error that has been propagated mostly for convenience in many modern medical systems. While there is really importance in having specialty care, an oncologist who takes care of a cancer patient, a cardiovascular expert who takes care of a person with cardiovascular conditions, there is value in thinking about care, not just for that individual condition, but this individual's health, overall health, and also the implications of that individual in their smaller ecosystems, which is their family and communities, and their larger ecosystems, which are their society. Health is not episodic or fragmented, but it is chronic, relational, and contextual. Implementation research, therefore, must be iterative, multidisciplinary, and flexible to thrive globally as a field. So with that, I'll stop, and thanks for your time and attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vedan, for that powerful presentation. There's so much to unpack, and I'm sure our audience has a lot of questions and reflections. Dr. HS, should we just go to the Q&A, or can I start? I
Yes,
have my
let's
own
go.
question.
You can start with your question. That's your prerogative as moderator, and then we can switch over to the ones on the Q&A. Thank you so much, Vidya. Thank you.
So Vidya, as someone who has worked across scientific discipline from clinical, scientific to mental health and all that, what should implementation researchers learn from molecular science about scaling innovation responsibly?
Yeah, I think, Bashir, thanks for that question. It's really an interesting question because I get that asked a lot as a molecular biologist. What am I doing in mental health, global mental health research? Any public health research, because really my research focused on a singular pathway and a few molecules that really control negative regulation in immune cells. But I think I want us to zoom out a little bit about and think about how we frame questions and think about how we ask how the scientific discipline has evolved. So it's always the question is problem solving, which is really thinking and addressing what does this particular issue require, and then and finding out key pieces that solve this puzzle, if you will. So in molecular biology, if I found that a gene was expressed, overexpressed, and perhaps there was a connection or a correlation, which every time that gene was either overexpressed or underexpressed, there was a specific condition, then we figure out why did this happen and find a mechanism to explain that phenomena. And I think that still continues in the way I think about these problems. So why does this work? Why is this? Are there conditions that kind of are associated with this? Is there, and then if so, how do we address them more as a in a holistic way?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I see a lot of questions in the chat, but I'm not going to go to the chart because one of the things about these things is about instructions and following those instructions. Even when you're writing grants or something, you have to read those instructions. To make it easier, we are going to focus first on those who follow the instruction and put the question in the Q&A button. So Vidya, there is this question here. This one, Don Bosco, will go to you first to talk about, but I also come back to Vidya to say, what is exactly, this is coming from Victor Oka. He says, what exactly is the problem with achieving collaboration among disciplines as regards implementation science? And how can researchers and practitioners from different disciplines integrate their expertise and perspective to develop and evaluate implementation strategies that address complex, multifaceted problems in real-world setting. So everybody talks about that issue with collaboration. How? What is really the problem?
Well, thank you very much, Victor. First of all, Victor is just a recent first graduate from University of Nigeria in Nsukka. I'm happy to have him here. So the issue with having collaboration is the realization that there is a problem to solve. And this problem is a multifaceted problem. And knowing that because the problem is a multifaceted one, no single individual, no single expert, or no single person has all it takes to solve that problem. So when people are working on suicide prevention, for example, there are several angles to suicide prevention. If, for example, you need data related to prevalence of suicide prevention, as a psychologist, even though I have some experience in it, I should realize that somebody with knowledge of epidemiology is better placed to it. If it is cost effectiveness, I should know that somebody that is a health economist is the best person to ask that question. If I am working with things that has to do with changing things in the system, for example, maybe the way they collect data, a systems engineer, health systems engineer is the best person to bring in. Because if I say I am jack of all trades and then I want to do everything, I might end up not doing anything, not achieving much at all. So it is that realization that this wisdom that comes from every source is important in solving that problem that makes the difference. And we also realize that we need to ground this in the reality of the lives of the people. Michigan State University Department of Public Health is so unique for me, and I love being here because it is the first department in the US that was co-created by members of the, co-created with the members of the community. That is, you want to start a department and you get to people in the community and ask them questions. What do you want us to do? How do you want us to do it? As researchers, we often assume we know it all and we just bring things into people. No, that is not how it is going to work. So if I give an instance of maybe a stigma reduction intervention, and I want to do integrative narrative therapy to solve problem of stigma, the therapy is psychological, but I'm going to work with media professionals, which is communication. I'm going to involve faith leaders as leaders in the community. And knowing that these people are important is for me the beginning, so that we all can talk about speaking in the same language to address that issue.
So John Bosco, I'm going to push back here. I'm going to push back because I don't think you have addressed Uka's problem. Because Uka, you are making the assumption that the problem is that we haven't realized that this collaboration are needed. But I think the question here is, why is it not happening? Because I think we all agree with these things you have said. I don't think that our problem is the realization that that multi people are needed. I think what Uka is pushing here, why is this not happening? So we realize that this is important. Just a guess. We're not holding you responsible for why it's not happening, but we're saying, do you have a sense as a researcher why this is not happening? Why this collaboration is not happening, despite these realizations that you have talked about?
Okay, Prof, I'm going to give you an instance with the Nigerian Mental Health Act that was recently passed. We, as people from other professions, are saying that that act is tilted towards psychiatry. But in reality, what we see in mental health settings in Nigeria is that idea of dominance. So for me, why it's not happening is that everybody wants to be a god. People want to be in control. They want to be seen as the only people that know it. So every other person is less important than they are. That is my experience about it.
So I will push back again and ask you, and I'll get out from this topic. So if that is happening, because the truth about it, we bring in the last time we had there, the Minister of Health was there. Nobody asked that question. And there were people from the psychology department. You can go back to your institution and shout in your bedroom. It doesn't work. But then there's a policy forum where the minister is there, where the people from the public is there. So the question I will ask is that in that, the people who came out with that act, the people who came out with the policy, were there someone from with the, because it's not something you can fight at John Bosco. The Psychological Association of Nigeria, did they put out a document to say we don't think this act? Did they do that? And then we'll go over to Vidya, see Vidya's hand
Prof,
up.
they
Did they do that?
did, but there is one mistake that we all realize that it is not important that we make at this time. Psychology bill is still not being passed. That is the Nigerian Psychology Council bill is not being passed today because when that bill was conceived, it was the clinical psychology that conceived it, and they wanted it to be for clinical psychology. But the other people from the other areas in psychology killed it. They wrote a petition and that bill died. But what would have been the best for psychology in Nigeria was to allow that clinical psychology bill to go through, and then we'll push for amendments later on to bring in other professionals. That is the approach we are adopting for this mental health bill. It is already passed. We are all working to promote it. But along the line, there will be amendments and everybody, I think, will be happy.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to hold your feet. Vidya, please. I just want to make sure you don't get off easy by that realization that at least you are doing something. And I like this idea of let it pass and then we can push for amendment to get it better so that perfection is not the enemy of progress. Vidya, you had your hand raised, please.
Yeah, I think that's a interesting distinction. And I really like that question. So when we talk about it, it was not while I wanted us to be in an optimistic mode that there's potential for us to work together. The important question and the elephant in the room is why doesn't this happen routinely? And I think one of the key, especially from a researcher's point of view, is the constraints, whether you're a researcher in a high income setting and more so in a low resource setting. One of the key issues is the funding limitation. So you can only apply and do, within the scope of what the funding mechanism allows. And there's only so much room to bring in all of the different expertise and collaborators we want. So that's one thing. Historically, there has been a place where communities have often worked within their own comfort zones, and now it has changed. Global health research in global health space has definitely pushed those boundaries much beyond what they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. But there's still, those silos still tend to exist. So funding is one thing. The existing comfort levels or our ability to move and think beyond your own, places of expertise where you routinely tap into. To John Bosco's point, if I had to do a research in Nigeria and I need a health economist, my automatic setting should not be to say, let me find a health economist who works in Flint, Michigan, but to think let me find an economist who can understand the context in which it works in Nigeria. And this is something we grapple with because often they'll say, I have a health economist in my grant, that's fine. And the point is, does that individual have the right lens to be able to provide the necessary features? So there's we all have to get a little out of our comfort zone and think about what real collaboration means, and that takes a while. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's not out of good intent. It's just because it needs to be pushed farther and farther.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vidya. Thank you. This is something, that question is something that we think of differently because we all think it should happen more. We all know that if it happens more, it will be good for everyone, but it's not happening. And that's some of the things. I'll just go to one of the questions and I'll turn it over to Dr. Bashir. One of the questions I see there that I'm interested to answer is one of these one to say it's an implementation science question. And the question is implementation research same as intervention study?
Did you want to take that, John Bosco, or I can?
Yes, go ahead, Vidya.
Okay. Yeah, so this is a question I actually, face a lot as a program officer. What really constitutes as implementation research? and what does not. Intervention study, or studying how effective an intervention is, whether the intervention works, how can I adapt it? All of those, in my view, are part of how implementation science works. So it is part of implementation research. In the implementation continuum, there are different pieces. And as I've noted, it's also not a linear scale. It's really an iterative scale that we are thinking about. So yes, while intervention studies are part of the larger gambit of implementation research. I hope that helps.
Yes, yes, thank you so much. Thank you. I mean, to think about it, I always say that in some intervention studies that you probably may be looking at something that works. In terms of in implementation science, you have to have something that already works. So it's just about how to get it done. I think that is also helpful because whenever you talk about implementation science, people will ask you, what is evidence-based intervention?
Yeah, one quick point where I want to slightly push for us to think this and clarify is, supposing we're developing an intervention, a telehealth intervention, and we are in the early process of just developing the intervention itself. One could argue that it more falls in the basic sciences or the early sciences and not really in the implementation continuum. But I also want us to think that there's not a wall, there's a lot of iteration that goes on. So that's why when I said it still fits into the implementation continuum or implementation research field, that's what I want to say. I understand that there are places where it could be its own thing for a brief second, but there is a need for them to integrate into this gray zone of implementation as if you really are thinking about sustainment and reach and penetration of the intervention.
Thank you so much. Dr. Bashir, is there a question you want to pull out from there?
Yes, there's a question by Isinene. He or she wants to know some specific barriers to implementing mental health intervention or research. I want to know things like stigma, workforce limitation, or policy gaps. How do you address that if you want to implement mental health intervention? I think closely related to that was she mentioned something about underreporting of mental health issues and how does this going to affect your implementation research in that subject area?
Okay, let me just say a few words about the issue regarding limitations. The important thing to bear in mind is to recognize the context of the intervention. So you can't have a successful implementation without contextual assessment of the reality or the environment where the implementation work is to be done. And what it implies is that in doing this, you need to involve stakeholders, local stakeholders, early and often in the development of any intervention. If it is that you are not developing, but rather adapting, it is still important to carry the people that are there along. For example, if I'm to do a stigma intervention, and what I want to do is to do it from the perspective of maybe contact-based education, I first of all have to realize that I need to have dialogue with people in that community. I should also involve local champions, like the leadership of such communities when I am doing so, or maybe even social media influencers to change the beliefs and attitudes of the people that are in that particular place towards mental health. If the issue of interest is that there are likely to be probability or possibility of social desirability and in the responses of the people, then I don't need to rely on one single source of information when I am collecting my data. Multiple data sources from interviews, from the self-report, or even from electronic health records are important to incorporate into the particular research that I am doing.
Thank you very
so
much.
Dr.
Lydia, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and it's actually a very important question for developing successful, interventions or that really address the issue at hand. So I think one of the key things in implementation is to be able to understand all of the different pieces of the puzzle that we are trying to solve. So yes, we are trying to solve the final piece that makes the picture perfect, but without having all of the other pieces, it's impossible to know what the picture looks like. And especially for things like stigma, this is an area that's close to my heart. And, at NCI, when I was serving as a program officer, this was often the case. So you want to do cancer control or cancer prevention or cancer care, and you still have to think about how does stigma affect, implement a program that addresses the disease, which is cancer, but really have all of these pieces in place. So whether it is community support or stigma, for example. So often, an intervention need not always address the entirety of stigma. But if it can adapt to being able to understand and design that intervention, keeping in mind that stigma is a lens in which cancer is viewed or this particular cancer is viewed, that is helpful for the way the intervention is designed. So it's not that you're going to solve cancer stigma, but you can design an intervention for cervical cancer prevention or care or treatment that includes a way of addressing stigma. So having those contexts and understanding those are really important. And that's why in my talk, I alluded to that important point of what we consider as real data is really key. So all of these are actually most often captured as qualitative data. These are not, you can't ask individuals whether they're experiencing stigma. They probably don't want to share, or there is a lot of barriers about understanding whether they actually have an inherent stigma for a condition, be it mental health or cancer or HIV for that matter. So designing tools and finding individuals who actually can get that information, which need not be a data point, but what we consider traditionally as data. That's where I wanted us to think about what we think typically as data and to push the boundaries of why that data is has to be that range of what we consider meaningful data has to be widened. So there's a lot more interest nowadays in mixed methods research for this very case.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
We'll take a pause from the question. We still have one more speaker that is around now. So kindly allow me to introduce Professor Gregory Aaron, one of the legends in mental health as well as implementation research. Greg is a clinical and organizational psychologist, professor of psychiatry, University of California, San Diego. He's the co-director there. He has over 300 peer-reviewed journals and has about 46,000 citations. He's one of the top 1% of the clarivate most influential researchers in social sciences. His research develops and tests implementation strategies to improve implementation of evidence-based practices all over the world, in the US, in Africa, Mexico, Norway, Finland. Like I said, he's a legend that has been mentioned by John Bosco before. So please join me in welcoming Gregory Aaron. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, and glad I could make it. Good to see you, Vidya, and everyone else. So, yeah, following on Dr. Vedham's presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about adaptation. So adapting framework, but also adapting implementation strategy. So here we go. I first have acknowledgments of support from our NIH and CDC, but also many collaborators. I can't go through them all right now, but I have no no conflicts to report. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the EPIS Exploration, Preparation, Implementation, Sustainment Framework. And I am also going to, excuse me, let me get my slides in order again. Yep, talk about mental health implementation studies in 3 different settings. One on mental health medication and psychosocial intervention for depression in Kenya, youth mental health and employment in Sierra Leone, led by Teresa Betancourt, and leadership and organizational change for implementation strategy adaptation for implementing mental health care in non-communicable disease clinics and other clinics in Malawi. So we'll get right into it. And for those of you not familiar with the EPIS framework, it's a framework that is developed really with a focus on community settings, community-based settings, but has also been used extensively in hospital settings, in health clinics with different clinical problems and issues and different implementation strategies. And so it's unique in some ways because it's both a process framework and determinant framework. And so the process is the 4 phases of implementation that are reflected in the name of EPIS, but also a determinant framework. So identifying dimensions of implementation and also characteristics of the innovation, constructs in the outer context, determinants in the inner context. And another unique feature of the EPIS framework is this idea of bridging factors. So what are the factors when we are thinking about, for example, a Ministry of Health impact on what's happening in provider organizations or clinics in the inner context? What are those policy directives? What are things that can impact how policy impacts inner context practice, or, for example, how advocacy might impact how policymakers think about and develop policies. So it's bidirectional for those bridging factors. And this is just an illustration of the EPIS framework looking at the 4 phases: exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainment. And the main thing to notice on this slide is that in each of the phases, the determinants in outer context and inner context may be similar or may be different throughout each phase. And so, I'm by no means suggesting that people include all of these constructs. When using any framework, you need to really focus on the context that you're working in and what determinants or what barriers or facilitators will impact your implementation in each of these phases. So this is a very quick overview of EPIS. I can spend a whole hour talking about it, but I want to just provide this resource. The EPIS framework website has descriptions of EPIS phases, the constructs. There are webinars that describe the use of EPIS framework. And there are a number of resources, for example, examples of how EPIS has been applied in different settings, measures for assessing EPIS constructs. We have interview guides for using EPIS, thinking about the determinants in the phases, publications that use EPIS, and worksheets and tools that you can download and use in your work applying the framework. Also guidance for activities related to engaging people in thinking through EPIS, and funded projects that have used or are using the EPIS framework. And I apologize for going so fast, but we have limited time. So here we go. So the first project, this was led by Susan Meffert. She's a psychiatrist at University of California, San Francisco. And this is a hybrid 1 type study, which means the focus is on effectiveness of non-specialist delivered psychotherapy, so a task-shifted psychotherapy model, or medication for major depressive disorder and PTSD, each of those alone or combined. So really looking at those effects individually and combined in outpatient care clinics at a county hospital in Kisumu County in Kenya. And for this project, that EPIS framework was used to identify determinants, but also thinking through the roles of the implementation team. And it's not just the implementation research team, but it's also, as I'll show you in a bit, engaging community members, hospital leaders and hospital staff, policymakers from the Kenya federal government, as well as county policymakers. And so you can see, as I mentioned, when using EPIS, you really want to narrow down the barriers and facilitators, or those determinants that you're going to focus on throughout the process, because there's sometimes just too many. So, there are ways to identify what are the key determinants that need to be addressed in order to be successful in implementation and sustainment. And the other thing I want to say about this is kind of it's about a weakness in many, many implementation studies. And that is that they don't think about sustainment at the beginning of the study. Because it's, one thing to test implementation strategies and do an implementation in a funded project, but then once the project ends, then that practice is no longer sustained. And so the benefit to public health in an ongoing way is lost. So we really like to thinking about sustainment even in the exploration phase, when we're thinking about what's the health problem we're going to address. What are the evidence-based interventions? As Dr. Ezianola mentioned, you want to come in with your evidence-based intervention that you're then going to test your implementation strategies for. And in this, let me just get this. So in looking through like the exploration phase, you can see the outer context determinants, inner context determinants, including things like staff, primary care clinics, healthcare providers, patients and volunteers. Outer context, this socio-political context, community health organizations, and professional organizations. And some of these determinants go through the different phases as you work through the EPIS framework. So, this approach in Kenya was to have a collaborative, adaptive, local, and national approach to thinking through what it's going to take to have a sustainable strategy for scaling non-specialist delivery of depression and trauma-related disorder outpatient treatment integrated with public sector primary care outpatient services. And the study team, it wasn't just the investigators, but it's this idea of an implementation resource team that is comprised of those community and federal stakeholders, thinking about need for ongoing adaptation, for sustainment and sustainability and scalability. So as Dr. Vedem was saying, thinking about adaptation that is most likely going to be needed, perhaps to the implementation strategy, maybe to the way the intervention is delivered, and using team-based strategies to really think through those issues through the EPIS phases. So we borrowed from some of my earlier work thinking about the dynamic adaptation process, like how do we really go through the process of engaging folks and working through. And so in the exploration phase, we do our assessment at multiple levels. In the preparation phase, we can convene our implementation resource team, which is combined of investigators from UCF, Kisumu hospitals, community health workers, NGOs, and local and federal representatives. So as we roll out in the implementation phase depression care, we're looking at if there are ad hoc adaptations needed, there's ongoing coaching and support, but also feeding back data such as fidelity coach ratings and patient satisfaction, patient functioning, engagement, and care to help us understand if we need further adaptations. So that's a pre-assessment need for adaptation, planned adaptations, but also cataloging and tracking emerging adaptations and using data and feedback to inform adaptation. So, we did a concept mapping study and we identified additional determinants to what we originally proposed. And when we put those in the EPIS framework, we noticed that our phases, for preparation, for exploration phases, and thinking about sustainment from the beginning, and then identifying issues in the inner context, such as workforce characteristics and the need to enhance workforce issues, implementation strategies that might be focused on workforce, but also thinking about policy directives that might be important. And those are outer context and other outer context issues such as financing for village health teams, local capacity and partnerships as bridging factors, bridging that outer and inner context, and then thinking through other bridging factors like cross-level workforce strategies. So that's a very quick description of how we've used EPIS and think about adaptation in the implementation process. The next project that I want to talk briefly about is the Youth Forward study, Sierra Leone, led by Teresa Betancourt, to address trauma, mental health, and employment in adolescents who suffered adversity. And some of these adolescents were child soldiers in the Civil War in Sierra Leone, and have gone through the Ebola crisis and other sort of trauma events. And in this study, we used the exploration preparation phases primarily, but really thought through all of the phases. And the goal was to adapt that dynamic adaptation process. And another approach that we had, the interagency collaborative team scale-up strategy, to engage communities and think through what needs to be adapted and utilized in Sierra Leone for this project. And so again, we even changed the language. So instead of the local language thought that outer circle and inner circle was more appropriate for that context than outer context, inner context, or in CFR, inner setting and outer setting. And as you can see here, the big picture is that the determinants or barriers and facilitators to be addressed in each phase vary. So that dynamic nature of what's happening in the service system is really critical as you go through and think through how to apply EPIS or any other framework to the implementation work that you're doing. So the Youth Forward EPIS framework and the dynamic adaptation process still did a lot of work, for example, in the exploration phase, getting political will and buy-in, the promise of the youth readiness intervention in a prior RCT that provided the evidence to be able to say, oh yes, this is an evidence-based intervention. Now we need to focus on implementation. And then having a partner, GIZ from Germany, that was really focused on youth employment. So bringing in the psychosocial intervention with the need for youth employment so that the adolescents could either develop their own kind of business or become ready for employment broader. And again, we have the implementation resource team made up of researchers, but also folks in country, including the program managers, trainers, youth readiness facilitators, but also leadership in policy in the region and in the country. And then in the implementation phase, still moving ahead with the youth readiness intervention, monitoring outcomes to inform the need for any adaptations or feedback. And so the EPIS framework was again adapted with the critical determinants in the outer context, in the inner context, specifically for this project, and the bridging factors. So how do you bridge that policy and service context? The research program for children in adversity, at Boston College, also bringing in a consortium of agencies who work in these domains. And then characteristics of the innovation itself, the youth readiness intervention, community advisory boards, supervisor facilitator dynamics, and development-focused adaptability of YRI and the employment. And then in the inner context, the buy-in and capacity, leadership and decision-making, expert-led fidelity and feedback, and contracting and embedding facilitators in the community. So just some very quick examples of what this looked like. And then the final one is adapting our leadership and organizational change intervention to advance mental health services and integration in Malawi. And this is called the ALIGN trial. And the goal is to integrate mental health care in non-communicable disease clinics, so depression screening and treatment in these clinics. And the trial aims were really to adapt the implementation strategy for the Malawian context using the adapt-it process, and then evaluate the impact of adapted implementation strategy on integration of mental health treatment into NCDs. So it's, again, we take into account multiple levels of the district health leadership, district commissioners, district director of health and social services, district health management teams, clinic coordinators and nurses, and then general service clinicians and nurses. So really thinking across levels about all these different levels of kind of policy, practice, engagement, and research as it moved ahead. And the leadership and organizational change for implementation strategy has been proven to be effective in improving implementation leadership and climate, reach and fidelity of interventions, and clinical outcomes in 5 randomized, large-scale randomized trials. And so we're taking a proven implementation strategy and say, how do we adapt this for work in Malawi? And so it's much more engaged, and rather than having the US folks do it, the team is training Malawians to do loci, to manage loci, to support their clinics, and really to roll this out so that, you know, the US researchers will be stepping back, and it'll be very, very much focused on Malawi. And the loci strategy uses data to identify ways to improve leadership and climate and repeat assessments to see how things are going. That informs leadership and implementation climate training in organizations, and then action planning to move forward through the implementation process. And I have slides for each of those, but I'm just going to go through quickly and say that, you know, currently loci's core components have been adapted, and now the training of leaders and staff in Malawi is happening. And so it'll be the first loci trial to engage first level and upper level leaders in equivalent interventions. So first level leaders in clinics, but also larger, higher up organization leaders to really move things ahead in Malawi and make it so Loci Malawi is owned by Malawi, not by US researchers. So I know we've been short on time, and I just want to point out the EPIS framework website can be really helpful, but also the implementationleadership.com website talks about the loci strategy, and you can get more information there. So with that, I am going to stop and go to the organizers and see if we have time for questions or if we have to move along.
Thank you so much, Prof. This is quite it's impactful. We didn't want you to stop. Yep. Prof. Eche?
Yeah. So I thought our time limit was at the 6:00 p.m.
Okay.
So if there are questions.
Any question before we?
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Greg Aarons. One of the things that I
I remember the first time Greg came to Nisa in Nigeria, which was the beginning of Nisa. And subsequently, when she came, somebody was presenting on the platform and was talking about a peace framework. And the person asked the question to say, have you ever used the APIS framework? Let me tell you a little bit about the APIS framework. And the person was describing the APIS framework. And after he finished, I asked the person and talked about Greg. I said, have you ever met Greg Allen? The guy said, no. I said, well, look front of you. And here he's sitting down. And Greg has been in at this conference for many, many different times. And hopefully he will be there again this September. So you'll get a chance to meet him in person. I know a lot of people who have used the peace framework. It is one of the things that we have used in Nigeria in so many different ways because of the way it allows us to organize the project that we do. So I'm very grateful that he's putting down here, but more important is the resources that he has shared with you today, where you can go to the website and then planning your project to be able to say, how can I actually plan my process around a piece and then be able to use those in terms of as a government framework and also as a different other things that I might study most around. So thank you so much, Greg. We do have a session evaluation for you in the chat Dropbox. And so please complete them before we drop off. What we're going to try to do is to go back to the questions and see that are there questions on the chat are there questions on the Q&A box that we can go back to?
Well, we've answered the question, I think.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And hopefully, this is our third day. This is our fourth day. Our last day is going to be tomorrow. And tomorrow we are going to look at implementation science in cancer prevention and control. And what we are hoping as we round off the week tomorrow is that you have a chance to be able to tell us, because as we end this, we are going to start to plan our next biannual research week. So please endeavor to come in tomorrow so that you're able to look at the 5 days, be able to give us evaluation. If you haven't done any, we are going to reshare all the evaluation for each of the 5 days so that you get a chance to give us a feedback. The feedback is going to help us be able to organize what topics we should bring back next time and what areas should we focus where we haven't covered over these years. And again, to talk about the abstract submission for Nisa is fast approaching. I think tomorrow is the first deadline on the 6th. So please try to submit your work. It's an opportunity for you to present and vie for the top researcher. What we have done over the last 10 years is that we have picked the top 3 abstracts from each of the year. So this year we are going to bring all of those top researchers that won the top abstract, and then we're going to look for the abstract of the decade. So there will be a voting by everyone that attends, and then we are going to vote on the top 3 abstracts that have been presented every year for the last 10 years. That's 30 abstracts. And we're going to find one that is going to be the abstract of the decade. So thank you so much as you come to this, and then I'll see you join us tomorrow, and have a blessed day. Thank you. That's everything.
Very much, Prof. As we close, just to offer a few reflections from today, from everyone, what is important is that integration is not an option. It has to be what we should do as we go into implementation research. And then we all agree that context matters a lot, whether you're working in a molecular lab, or a community clinic, or policy. Real impact lies in translating evidence into action. And the final thing is that collaboration is what fuels progress. We have to just work together irrespective of our discipline, whether you're a scientist, implementer, system thinker, all of us, if we really want to bridge the divide in terms of mental health and physical health. So on behalf of Nisa, I want to really appreciate Professor Gregory for coming, Dr. Vedam and Dr. John Bosco. We appreciate you, and we're really grateful for your presence today. Thank you, everyone, and see you tomorrow for the next session. Bye-bye.